In the early 1980s, the United States Air Force quietly reached a troubling conclusion. The aircraft that had secured American air superiority for a generation might not survive the next war. This realization did not come overnight. It emerged from classified intelligence reports, war games conducted deep inside the Pentagon, and careful analysis of Soviet aviation programs. By the end of the 1970s, the U.S. had fielded what many believed were the finest fighters in the world, the F-15 Eagle and the F-16 Fighting Falcon. They were fast, powerful, and deadly. Yet across the Iron Curtain, a new threat was taking shape. The Soviet Union was introducing the Su-27 and MiG-29, aircraft designed not merely to match American fighters, but to challenge them directly. These new jets combined high speed, long range, heavy armament, and unprecedented maneuverability. For the first time since the dawn of the jet age, U.S. planners faced the possibility that air superiority could no longer be taken for granted. At the same time, another revolution was unfolding, one invisible to radar operators. Advances in surface-to-air missile systems, radar networks, and infrared tracking threatened even the fastest aircraft. The lessons of Vietnam still lingered in the institutional memory of the Air Force. Speed alone was no longer enough. The skies were becoming crowded, lethal, and unforgiving. In 1981, as Ronald Reagan entered the White House and defense spending surged to Cold War highs, the U.S. Air Force made a historic decision. It would not simply upgrade existing fighters. Instead, it would leap forward, technologically, doctrinally, and conceptually. That decision became known as the Advanced Tactical Fighter Program, or ATF. The goal of ATF was nothing less than to redefine air combat for the 21st century. Officially announced in 1981, the ATF program sought a next-generation air superiority fighter to replace the F-15 Eagle. But behind the dry language of Pentagon documents lay far more ambitious intentions. The new aircraft would not merely win dogfights. It would see the enemy first, strike first, and remain largely unseen while doing so. For the first time, stealth was not an afterthought. It was a core requirement. The Air Force issued a list of demands that, taken together, seemed almost unrealistic. The new fighter had to cruise at supersonic speed without using afterburners, a capability later known as supercruise. It needed extreme maneuverability, not just at low speeds, but across the entire flight envelope. It had to take off and land on relatively short runways, increasing survivability in a conflict where major air bases could be targeted. And above all, it had to dramatically reduce both radar and infrared visibility. In simple terms, the ATF was expected to fly faster than any operational fighter, turn harder than its adversaries, carry advanced weapons internally, and remain nearly invisible to enemy sensors. This was not science fiction. It was doctrine. The requirements were shaped by decades of analysis, including studies conducted by RAND Corporation and internal Air Force think tanks. One recurring conclusion stood out. In future wars, the side that controlled the air in the opening days would control the outcome of the conflict. Air superiority was no longer just a tactical advantage. It was strategic necessity. To achieve this, the Air Force turned to America's aerospace industry. Requests for proposals were sent to the nation's leading aircraft manufacturers: Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, McDonnell Douglas, and Northrop. Each company understood what was at stake. The ATF contract would define the future of U.S. military aviation and secure billions of dollars for decades. The competition also reflected a broader shift in American military thinking. During the 1960s and 1970s, fighter development had often been evolutionary, improving radar here, engines there. ATF demanded something different. It demanded integration. Stealth shaping, advanced materials, Digital flight control systems, sensor fusion, all had to work together as a single, coherent system. One Air Force document from the period summarized the philosophy bluntly. The next air superiority fighter must dominate before it is detected. This emphasis on invisibility was not theoretical. It was influenced directly by classified programs already underway. In 1978, the F-117 stealth attack aircraft had flown in secret. Though unknown to the public at the time, its existence proved that radar invisibility was achievable. The success of that program would cast a long shadow over ATF. Equally important was the strategic context of the early 1980s. NATO planners expected that any large-scale conflict with the Warsaw Pact would begin with massive air battles over Central Europe. Soviet numerical superiority meant American pilots could not rely on numbers alone. Quality, technology, and surprise would have to compensate. The ATF was designed for that first, violent phase of war, the moment when control of the skies would be decided. By the mid-1980s, after years of studies and concept validation, the Air Force narrowed the field. In 1986, 2 teams were selected to move forward into full-scale prototype development. The choice itself reflected experience with stealth technology and large, complex defense programs. One team was led by Lockheed, joined by Boeing and General Dynamics. Lockheed already possessed invaluable stealth expertise thanks to the F-117, and its legendary Skunk Works division had built aircraft like the U-2 and SR-71 under intense secrecy. The second team was led by Northrop, partnered with McDonnell Douglas. Northrop was deeply immersed in another revolutionary project, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, a program that pushed low observable design to its absolute limits. The stage was set for one of the most consequential aerospace competitions in American history. Few outside classified circles understood what was coming. The public still associated air combat with dogfights and afterburners. But inside secure hangars and design offices, a new kind of fighter was taking shape. One that would not announce its presence with speed or noise, but with silence. And among the aircraft born from this moment, one would emerge as perhaps the most radical fighter design the United States had ever produced. A machine so advanced that even today, decades later, its full story remains largely unknown. That story begins here, at the moment when the Air Force decided that winning the next war meant building an aircraft the enemy might never see at all. As the Advanced Tactical Fighter program moved from theory to reality, the contest quietly transformed into something far larger than a simple aircraft competition. It became a clash of industrial philosophies, corporate survival, and competing visions of how future wars would be fought in the air. By the mid-1980s, the U.S. aerospace industry was undergoing profound change. The golden age of massive Cold War procurement was beginning to narrow, and major defense contracts were becoming fewer, but vastly more complex. Winning ATF would mean decades of production, upgrades, and political influence. Losing could threaten a company's very existence. In 1986, after reviewing a mountain of preliminary concepts and classified studies, the U.S. Air Force made its decisive move. 2 industry teams were selected to proceed to the prototype phase. Each would be given 4 years to design, build, and fly 2 experimental aircraft. The winner would shape American air power well into the 21st century. The first team was led by Lockheed, joined by Boeing and General Dynamics. This was no coincidence. Lockheed's Skunk Works had already demonstrated something no other company could claim: real-world stealth aircraft in operational service. The F-117 Nighthawk, still officially secret at the time, had proven that low observability was not merely theoretical. It could be built, maintained, and flown by combat pilots. Lockheed's pedigree extended even further back. In the 1960s, the company had created the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft that combined extreme speed, altitude, and reduced radar signature in ways that had never been matched. Though designed as a reconnaissance platform, the Blackbird demonstrated that shaping, materials, and thermal management could dramatically affect detectability. Those lessons would quietly influence every stealth aircraft that followed. Boeing and General Dynamics brought their own strengths. Boeing had deep experience in aerodynamics, structures, and large-scale manufacturing. General Dynamics had produced the F-16, a fighter that revolutionized agility through relaxed static stability and fly-by-wire controls. Together, the Lockheed-led team represented an evolutionary path forward, radical technology, but applied in a way that preserved conventional fighter characteristics. Opposing them was a team led by Northrop, partnered with McDonnell Douglas. On paper, this alliance looked equally formidable, but philosophically it was very different. Northrop was already immersed in one of the most ambitious aircraft projects in history, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Unlike the faceted shapes of the F-117, the B-2 relied on smooth, continuous curves and carefully aligned edges to scatter radar energy. It was stealth taken to its logical extreme, expensive, complex, and breathtakingly advanced. The B-2 program forced Northrop engineers to rethink nearly every aspect of aircraft design: aerodynamics without vertical tails, exhaust management to suppress infrared signatures, and flight control systems capable of stabilizing inherently unstable flying wing configurations. By the mid-1980s, these engineers were operating at the cutting edge of low-observable science. McDonnell Douglas, for its part, brought decades of fighter experience. The company had produced legendary aircraft such as the F-4 Phantom II, F-15 Eagle, and F-A-18 Hornet. If Northrop provided the stealth DNA, McDonnell Douglas ensured that the result would still function as a practical combat aircraft. Thus, two visions emerged. Lockheed's concept emphasized a balance between stealth and traditional fighter performance, with particular attention to close-in maneuverability and growth potential. Northrop's approach leaned more heavily toward invisibility, designing an aircraft optimized to strike first at long range before an enemy ever realized it was under attack. The rivalry extended beyond airframes. The ATF program also included a parallel competition between engine manufacturers. Each prototype team was required to fly one aircraft powered by a Pratt & Whitney engine and another using a General Electric design. Pratt & Whitney offered what would become the F-119 engine, a conservative but highly refined power plant emphasizing reliability and controllability. General Electric countered with the YF-120, a more radical variable cycle engine capable of shifting between high-thrust and high-efficiency modes. On paper, the YF-120 promised superior performance and fuel economy, but it also carried greater technical risk. This dual competition reflected the Air Force's broader mindset at the time. The service was willing to embrace innovation, but it remained deeply cautious about cost overruns, maintenance complexity, and schedule delays. Memories of troubled programs from the 1970s still loomed large. By contract, both teams were required to produce 2 flying prototypes within 4 years, an extraordinarily aggressive timeline given the technologies involved. These aircraft would not be fully combat-equipped, but they had to demonstrate stealth characteristics, supercruise capability, advanced flight controls, and overall performance. Behind the scenes, the pressure was immense. Congressional oversight intensified as costs climbed. Internal Air Force debates grew sharper. Some officers questioned whether stealth should be prioritized over dogfighting ability. Others argued that the very idea of close-range air combat was becoming obsolete in the age of long-range missiles and airborne warning systems. This debate was not academic. It would ultimately determine which aircraft would be built and which would never leave the prototype stage. By the late 1980s, as design studies solidified into metal and composite structures, it became clear that the two contenders would look nothing alike. One would resemble an evolution of the classic American fighter. The other would appear almost alien, shaped by radar equations rather than tradition. Few outside the program realized just how unconventional one of these aircraft would be. When it finally emerged into public view, it would challenge everything pilots, engineers, and observers thought they knew about what a fighter was supposed to look like. And when that moment came, the competition would move from drawing boards and briefing rooms to the unforgiving skies above the California desert, where theory would finally be tested against reality. When the aircraft finally appeared in public, it was immediately clear that one of the competitors had taken the Air Force's requirements to their most uncompromising extreme. On June 22, 1990, under the bright sun of the Mojave Desert, Northrop and McDonnell Douglas rolled their prototype onto the runway at Edwards Air Force Base. Officially designated the YF-23, the aircraft bore little resemblance to any fighter the world had ever seen. Even among seasoned test pilots, engineers, and defense officials, the reaction was the same: surprise, followed quickly by unease. This was not a conventional fighter. It looked less like a descendant of the F-15 or F-16, and more like a weapon shaped by mathematics rather than tradition. From above, the YF-23's planform was defined by long, straight, parallel edges, a deliberate choice rooted in radar physics. These aligned edges ensured that radar energy would be scattered away from the emitting source instead of reflecting directly back. Unlike earlier stealth designs that relied on faceted surfaces, the YF-23 used smooth, continuous curves combined with precise edge alignment, a philosophy inherited directly from the B-2 Spirit. The aircraft's wings formed a diamond shape, with matching sweep angles on both the leading and trailing edges. This symmetry was not aesthetic. It reduced radar cross-section across a wide range of frequencies. Even the wing roots blended seamlessly into the fuselage, eliminating sharp transitions that could betray the aircraft's presence to enemy sensors. Perhaps the most striking feature was the absence of traditional tail surfaces. Instead of vertical stabilizers and horizontal tail planes, the YF-23 employed two large, all-moving control surfaces mounted at roughly a 50-degree angle outward from the fuselage. These V-shaped tails perform the functions of both rudder and elevator, while drastically reducing radar reflections from vertical surfaces. Long recognized as one of the greatest contributors to detectability. But the most radical design choice lay hidden from casual view. The engines were buried deep within the fuselage, and their exhaust flowed through flattened, trough-like nozzles mounted high on the aircraft's upper surface. This configuration served two purposes. First, it shielded the hot exhaust from ground-based infrared sensors. Second, it allowed the airflow over the aircraft to mix with the exhaust plume, rapidly cooling it before it could be detected by heat-seeking missiles. The surfaces surrounding these exhausts were lined with advanced, heat-resistant materials capable of withstanding extreme temperatures. Some of these materials traced their lineage to NASA programs, including thermal protection systems developed for the space shuttle. This was not coincidence. Northrop had drawn expertise from across the aerospace sector to solve problems few fighters had ever faced. Air intake design was equally meticulous. The YF-23 used S-shaped inlet ducts to prevent radar from seeing directly into the engine compressor blades, a notorious source of radar reflections. The interior of these ducts was coated with radar-absorbing materials, further reducing the aircraft's electromagnetic signature. To radar systems, The YF-23 was not merely small, it was confusing, fragmented, and often indistinguishable from background noise. Inside the cockpit, the aircraft remained purposefully restrained. The YF-23 was a single-seat fighter, with the pilot seated slightly higher than the wing plane to improve forward visibility. Unlike later stealth aircraft with extensive glass cockpits, this prototype focused on proving airframe performance rather than avionics integration. Many of its most advanced sensor concepts were planned for a production version that would never come. Weapons were to be carried internally, stored between the engine nacelles. This eliminated the need for external pylons, which dramatically increase radar signature. Even the gun, a staple of American fighter design, was omitted from the prototype, reflecting the program's emphasis on beyond visual range combat rather than close-in dogfighting. At its core, the YF-23 was aerodynamically unstable by design. This instability reduced drag and improved maneuverability, but it made the aircraft unflyable without constant computer correction. A fully digital fly-by-wire system continuously adjusted control surfaces hundreds of times per second, maintaining stability while allowing the aircraft to perform with remarkable smoothness at both subsonic and supersonic speeds. Northrop engineers were confident. Wind tunnel testing, radar range measurements, and classified simulations all suggested that the YF-23 achieved levels of stealth unmatched by any fighter, including its competitor. In internal briefings, the aircraft was described not as a dogfighter, but as a predator, a platform designed to detect, engage, and destroy enemy aircraft long before visual contact. This philosophy extended to how the YF-23 was expected to operate in combat. Rather than relying solely on its own radar emissions, the aircraft was intended to receive targeting data from satellites, ground stations, and airborne early warning aircraft such as the E-3 AWACS. By minimizing its own emissions, the YF-23 could remain effectively invisible while still maintaining full situational awareness. Two prototypes were constructed, as required by the ATF contract. The first, known as Prototype Air Vehicle 1, was finished in a dark gray and black scheme and powered by Pratt & Whitney's F-119 engine. The second, Prototype Air Vehicle 2, featured a lighter gray paint and was equipped with General Electric's experimental YF-120 engine. Each represented not just a different engine, but a different vision of propulsion. Where the Pratt & Whitney engine emphasized reliability and control, the General Electric design pursued adaptability, capable of shifting operating cycles to optimize thrust or fuel efficiency depending on the flight regime. To many observers, the YF-23 looked less like a fighter and more like a glimpse of the future, a future where air combat would be decided not by turning radius or gun accuracy, but by who remained unseen the longest. Yet for all its sophistication, the aircraft had one unavoidable problem. It challenged deeply held assumptions within the Air Force about what a fighter should be and how it should fight. As the YF-23 prepared to take to the air, its fate would depend not only on performance data, but on whether the institution evaluating it was ready to embrace a radically different vision of aerial warfare. The desert skies above Edwards would soon provide answers no briefing ever could. The moment of truth came not in a briefing room, but on the runway. On August 27, 1990, the first YF-23 prototype lifted off from Edwards Air Force Base for the very first time. At the controls was Paul Metz, a veteran Northrop test pilot with thousands of flight hours and deep experience in experimental aircraft. The takeoff was deliberately uneventful, a hallmark of successful test flights. But what followed would quietly confirm years of design theory. From the outset, the aircraft behaved exactly as its engineers had predicted. The fly-by-wire system masked its inherent instability with remarkable precision, giving the pilot a smooth, almost effortless sense of control. Unlike many experimental aircraft, the YF-23 did not feel temperamental or unpredictable. In Metz's later words, it was surprisingly well-mannered, even in early flight testing. Less than 2 months later, on October 26, 1990, the second prototype joined the program. By then, confidence in the design had grown. The Air Force test team, which included pilots from both Northrop and the Air Force Flight Test Center, began expanding the flight envelope methodically, increasing speed, altitude, and maneuvering loads step by step. Over the course of the test program, the two YF-23 aircraft completed a combined total of approximately 50 flights. Prototype Air Vehicle 1 accounted for the majority, flying 34 times, while Prototype Air Vehicle 2 completed 14 flights. Together, they accumulated nearly 66 flight hours. By the standards of operational aircraft, this was modest. By the standards of prototype competitions, it was enough. The most significant achievement came when the YF-23 demonstrated sustained supersonic flight without the use of afterburners. During test runs, the aircraft cruised at speeds exceeding the Mach 1.6 in dry thrust, a capability that directly met one of the ATF program's most demanding requirements. Unlike afterburner-assisted supersonic flight, supercruise allowed the aircraft to maintain high speed while conserving fuel and minimizing infrared signature. Equally important was how the aircraft performed at those speeds. Many fighters of the era could briefly exceed Mach 1, but handling often degraded sharply in the transonic and supersonic regimes. The YF-23, by contrast, remained stable and controllable, with no evidence of the pitch-up tendencies or control anomalies that had plagued earlier high-speed designs. Maneuverability, while not the aircraft's primary selling point, proved more than adequate. At high speeds, the YF-23 demonstrated smooth, predictable response to control inputs. Engineers noted that its large wing area and blended fuselage contributed to excellent lift characteristics, particularly in sustained maneuvers. Though it lacked thrust vectoring nozzles, the aircraft was never intended to dominate close-in dogfights. Its strength lay elsewhere. What the test program did not include, however, was equally telling. Unlike its rival, the YF-22, the YF-23 never conducted live missile separation or firing tests during the ATF competition. Officially, this was a matter of prioritization and schedule. Northrop focused on validating stealth, propulsion, and supercruise, the areas where the aircraft was expected to excel. Unofficially, some within the Air Force viewed the absence of weapons testing as a missed opportunity to demonstrate combat readiness. Stealth performance, much of it classified, was evaluated through a combination of ground-based radar measurements, flight test instrumentation, and modeling. While specific numbers remain secret to this day, multiple individuals involved in the program have stated that the YF-23 met or exceeded all low observable requirements set by the Air Force. In several regimes, it reportedly outperformed its competitor, particularly in frontal radar cross-section and infrared suppression. The engine competition unfolded in parallel. The General Electric YF-120, installed in prototype Air Vehicle 2, impressed many observers with its adaptability and raw performance. Its variable cycle design allowed it to optimize airflow for different phases of flight, delivering excellent thrust at high speeds and improved efficiency during cruise. Some engineers believed it represented the future of fighter propulsion. The Pratt & Whitney F-119, while less radical, proved extremely reliable and predictable throughout testing. For Air Force officials responsible for long-term maintenance and fleet readiness, this distinction mattered greatly. By December 1990, the flight test phase of the ATF competition came to an end. Both teams submitted their data, performance analyses, and cost projections to the Air Force. The aircraft were grounded, and attention shifted from the runway to conference rooms in Washington, where decisions would be influenced by more than just aerodynamic charts. Behind closed doors, debates intensified. Some officers were deeply impressed by the YF-23's stealth and speed, seeing it as the ideal interceptor for the opening days of a high-end conflict. Others worried that its design philosophy placed too much faith in beyond visual range combat, a concept still viewed with skepticism by pilots shaped by decades of dogfighting doctrine. There were also practical concerns. The YF-23's advanced materials and unconventional structures raised questions about cost, repairability, and production scalability. The Air Force, mindful of congressional scrutiny and budgetary uncertainty following the end of the Cold War, began to weigh risk more heavily than raw performance. In the end, the YF-23 had done exactly what it was designed to do. It proved that an aircraft optimized for stealth and speed could meet, and in some areas exceed, the most ambitious requirements ever set for a fighter. What remained uncertain was whether the institution evaluating it was prepared to accept the consequences of such a bold choice. The final decision would come in the spring of 1991, and when it did, it would shape not only the future of American air power, but the fate of one of the most advanced fighters ever built, a machine that may have been too far ahead of its time. The decision, when it came, arrived with the quiet finality that often accompanies history's most consequential moments. On April 23, 1991, the United States Air Force officially announced the winner of the Advanced Tactical Fighter competition. The Lockheed-led team's YF-22 had been selected for full-scale development. In time, it would enter service as the Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor. The engine competition was decided the same day. Pratt & Whitney's F-119 was chosen over General Electric's more radical YF-120. With a single press release, the future of American air superiority was set, and the fate of the YF-23 was sealed. Publicly, the Air Force emphasized pragmatism. Officials cited the YF-22's perceived growth potential, its closer alignment with traditional fighter doctrine, and what they described as lower technical and financial risk. In an era when the Cold War was ending and defense budgets were coming under increasing scrutiny, confidence mattered as much as performance. The YF-22, they argued, offered a clearer path from prototype to operational squadron. The numbers, at least on paper, seemed to support that view. In 1990, the ATF program was projected to cost approximately $63.5 billion, with an expected production run of 750 aircraft. Even then, Air Force planners understood that these figures were optimistic. Every major defense program of the era had exceeded initial estimates. The service wanted an aircraft it believed could be delivered on time and within political tolerance. Yet almost immediately, questions began to circulate. Quietly at first, then more openly. Among engineers, test pilots, and defense analysts, there was a widespread acknowledgement that the YF-23 had not lost on technical merit alone. In several critical areas, particularly stealth and sustained supersonic performance, it was widely regarded as superior. Some insiders described it as the stealthiest fighter ever evaluated by the Air Force, even compared to aircraft that would follow decades later. Why, then, was it passed over? One explanation lay in doctrine. For generations, American fighter culture had been shaped by the belief that air combat was unpredictable, chaotic, and often resolved at close range. Despite advances in radar and missile technology, many pilots still distrusted beyond visual range engagements. Rules of engagement, identification challenges, and electronic countermeasures had historically forced fighters into dogfights. The YF-22, with its thrust vectoring engines and exceptional low-speed agility, embodied that philosophy. It could fight at long range, but it was also designed to win when fights became close and brutal. The YF-23, by contrast, reflected a colder, more calculated vision of war. It assumed that information dominance, stealth, and first-shot advantage would define future conflicts. In this concept, the best dogfight was the one that never happened. The YF-23 was optimized to detect, engage, and destroy enemy aircraft from beyond visual range, then disappear without ever being seen. To some in the Air Force, this was visionary. To others, it was risky. There were also strategic considerations shaped by politics rather than aerodynamics. In the early 1990s, Northrop was already deeply entrenched in the extraordinarily expensive B-2 Spirit program. By 1990 alone, the B-2 had absorbed more than $20 billion in government funding, and controversy over its cost was intensifying in Congress. Lockheed, on the other hand, faced a different reality. The F-117 program was winding down, and without a major follow-on contract, the company risked losing both expertise and influence. Awarding ATF to Lockheed helped preserve competition within the defense industrial base, an unspoken but powerful factor in procurement decisions. Even the engine decision reflected institutional caution. General Electric's YF-120 was admired for its innovation, but its variable cycle design introduced complexity that worried logisticians and maintainers. Pratt & Whitney's F-119, though less ambitious, offered predictability and confidence, qualities highly valued by an Air Force preparing to field a fleet expected to serve for decades. In hindsight, the irony is difficult to ignore. Many of the assumptions that favored the YF-22 would later be questioned. As the F-22 entered service in the mid-2000s, it proved extraordinarily capable, but also staggeringly expensive. The original plan for 750 aircraft was steadily reduced. In the end, only 187 production F-22s were built. Unit costs soared, and the aircraft's complexity limited export opportunities, even to close allies. Meanwhile, the nature of air combat evolved closer to the YF-23's original vision. Networked warfare, data fusion, satellite queuing, and long-range engagements became central to modern doctrine. Exercises increasingly emphasized first detection and first-shot advantages. In some training scenarios, F-22 pilots were penalized if engagements devolved into close-range dogfights, an implicit acknowledgement that stealth fighters were not meant to fight that way. The YF-23, it seemed, had been pointing toward a future the Air Force was not yet ready to fully embrace. After the competition ended, both YF-23 prototypes were quietly retired. They never flew again. Their engines and instrumentation were removed, and the airframes were placed into storage at NASA's Dryden Flight Research Center, later renamed Armstrong Flight Research Center. There was no dramatic farewell, no final flyover, no official recognition of what had been lost. In 1996, the aircraft re-emerged, not in the skies, but in museums. Prototype Air Vehicle 1 was placed on display at the Western Museum of Flight at Edwards Air Force Base. Prototype Air Vehicle 2 found its home at the Northrop Grumman Hawthorne Campus Museum in California. There, they remain today, silent, angular reminders of a path not taken. To casual observers, they look like relics of an experimental era. To those who understand their story, they represent something more profound. The YF-23 was not a failure. It did exactly what it was designed to do. It met the Air Force's requirements, validated radical stealth concepts, and demonstrated performance that remains impressive even by modern standards. Its true shortcoming was timing. History is filled with machines that arrive too early, technologies that solve tomorrow's problems in yesterday's world. The YF-23 belongs firmly in that category. It was a fighter designed for an information-dominated battlefield, evaluated by an institution still rooted in the lessons of past wars. Today, as sixth-generation fighter concepts emphasize stealth, range, passive sensors, and networked combat, the YF-23 feels less like an outlier and more like a precursor. Its influence, though indirect, can be traced in the design philosophies now shaping the future of air power. And so, the story of the YF-23 ends not with combat victories or squadron service, but with a question, one that still lingers decades later. What if the Air Force had chosen invisibility over agility? What if the first fifth-generation fighter had been built not to be seen, but to never be known at all? In the quiet halls of museums and the fading memories of engineers who built it, the YF-23 remains a reminder that sometimes the most advanced weapon is not the one that wins, but the one that shows us where the future is heading.